Hey everyone, it's Baka here, back with another Friday workshop. This week we're going to be starting a new series. We're going to be looking at some visual art this week and next week. Specifically, we're going to be looking at perspective drawing. This week we're going to be looking at single point perspective, and next week we're going to be looking at multi-point perspective. Now, perspective drawing is really this. It's drawing things three-dimensionally, accurately, and how they appear in space or in a natural environment, how they would really appear. This is actually a really simple technique. It can get confusing the more complex you get, but the basic rules always apply. This is something that I teach to my introduction to 2D studio, or 2D art class, that is. Let's get rid of that warning. And this is actually one of the very first things I teach them because it helps them with all the rest of the drawing they do. Before we get started, I want to look at three different vocabulary words. Those are vanishing point, horizon line, and perspective lines. Now, a vanishing point is that point in space, which think of it as an imaginary point because usually there's not an actual point there. But this is the point at which all things, as they move away from the viewer in space, lead to. They all lead to this one point. And by that I mean the lines of the different objects in space. Your eye will be drawn to a specific point. Now, the horizon line is the actual or imaginary line in space that this vanishing point falls on. Now, if you were to look at a horizon of a landscape, let's say you're on a nice flat plane, you look outside, and where the ground meets the sky, that's your horizon line. Sometimes if you've got things like a forest that starts before that horizon line, it can muddle up where you think the horizon line is. You might think it actually starts at the bottom of the forest, but it doesn't. It starts where that land meets the sky, and sometimes it's in the middle of that forest. That's going to be the case with an example I'm going to show you just a little bit later. Now, perspective lines, this is a vocabulary term that I'm going to use a lot. Perspective lines are the imaginary lines that lead from your objects to that vanishing point. These are what actually cause the three-dimensionality to be accurate. With simpler shapes, these are very apparent. The more complex the shapes that you use, the trickier these can be, or sometimes the less accurate they look. They will be accurate. They just might have an optical illusion that shows they're not. So I'm going to open up Photoshop here, and it doesn't matter that I'm using Photoshop. Think of this as though we are doing this on pencil and paper. Now, what I'm going to start out with first here is an exercise that I do with my students. This is how we kick this off. I give them a worksheet with 4 or 5 basic shapes. I'm only using 2 for this because of time restraints, but I've got 2 basic shapes. I've got a rectangle and a triangle. Now, the vanishing point for this is arbitrary. I'm using one vanishing point for both shapes just for simplicity's sake. And I just randomly popped it right there, kind of in the middle of the 2. Now, to find the perspective lines, what you have to do is you have to find the corners of these basic shapes that have a clear line of sight to this vanishing point. So this top left corner, or this top right corner, this top left corner, and this bottom right corner all have a straight shot without any part of that shape getting in the way. This bottom left corner would have to go all the way through the shape to get that. So technically it would be a perspective line, but it can't be seen, so we don't have to worry about it for drawing. So what you end up getting is you get perspective lines that look like this. I'm using red for this perspective lines and the vanishing point, so you know that they don't stay like that. Now, when you're drawing these these shapes in 3 dimensions, because these are nice and simple shapes, it's really easy to figure out those perspective lines. Where do you draw your lines? Now, the only thing I will say aside from that is not all of your lines will be perspective lines. Because this is 1-point perspective, only really just everything goes to one spot. So anything that's facing you is a flat shape. So any lines that run parallel to that are also flat shapes. Or flat, I guess they'd be shapes. So if you start here in the upper left-hand corner, you can draw a line towards this vanishing point. But you don't need to draw it all the way there. So I'm going to stop it about there. Now before I draw any other perspective lines, I've got to put a back to the top of this box, a back line. Now because this is going to be a box, a rectangular box, that line needs to be parallel with this top front line. So just from where I ended with that perspective line, I'm going to draw a line that goes horizontally, or as close to horizontal as I can make it with my mouse. Now I can take from that point and I can go back to this corner along the perspective line. It's kind of like connect the dots from here on out. On this side, I need a line that runs parallel to its opposite number, which is a vertical line. Think of it like this. I've got a horizontal line. The opposite end of the top of my box should also be horizontal. Here I have a vertical line. The opposite end of the side of this box should also be a vertical line. So I will run that down to the perspective line, and then I can finish up by connecting the dots. And if I just make those perspective lines vanish, I've now got a box that goes back into space. It's 3-dimensional and it's accurate. Now I will say this before I get into the triangle because the same rules are going to apply. The closer your object gets to that vanishing point, the more distorted it looks. It is still accurate. It is still a accurate 3-dimensional object that if you were to hold it in your hands would be a rectangular box. It's just that as it gets closer, those perspective lines get closer, and it just looks more distorted. It looks stretched out. So the same thing holds true with the triangle. In this case, only 2 of the corners meet up with that perspective line. This one has to go through the triangle. If I move this vanishing point up here, then you might be able to get all 3 sides. It might look really weird, but technically it would work. So I'm going to pop in those 2 perspective lines. And the same thing holds true. I'll start in one corner, and I'll go along the perspective line. I'll stop. I need to run a line that's parallel to here. So I'll do that to the other perspective line, and then I'll just finish up connecting the dots. And when I make those perspective lines disappear, oops, I didn't mean to do that, I get a triangular prism. Now I could have continued them on, or I could have changed the shape of my triangle, did some other things. I could have had a pyramid. But that's not what I was looking for. I was looking for a triangular prism. I wanted to show you this opposite end. So that's just the basic. And you can take a bunch of different shapes and you can practice this. It's a great way to first start out doing perspective drawing. We, however, are going to move on. I'm going to make that disappear for a second. We're going to move on to the first project that I have my students do, and that is to do a single point perspective drawing of an indoor hallway. Now, I'm going to use the basics of the hallway that my students use because it's fairly basic and it should be kind of nice and easy to work with. Now you've got your vanishing point in the middle, this nice red dot, and you've got your horizon line that passes through. Now when you're in an interior space, the horizon line does not necessarily mean that that is where the floor meets the back wall, where horizontal meets vertical. It honestly depends on where your line of vision is. If you sit down on the ground, your vanishing point is going to raise. If you're standing up, your vanishing point is going to lower. So if you are standing up on a ladder, you can get your horizon line to line up with where the floor meets the wall. But we're going to take this as though we are sitting in a chair. So we look back through the hall, and at the very back end is a tall, skinny wall, because this is the idea of this is at a school. It's a one-story school, but there are nice big windows on either side. So we get a tall, skinny wall at the end. Now, because this is interior, everything that goes back in space goes to that horizon line, or goes to that vanishing point. I'm sorry. In this case, though, this vanishing point is inside of this object. But what you have to realize, you have to kind of do a double take on this, because this rectangle here is the back wall of this room. Everything is going to that wall. So what happens is, remember, this is an imaginary point. But perspective lines are still going to go from this point. And so what you want to do, if you want to create lines for the walls and the ceilings, you go from this vanishing point, and you still meet up with the corners of this wall. So I'm going to create these 4 vanishing points, or 4 perspective lines. I am getting my vocab all messed up today. Go to these nice 4 corners here. But you have to remember one thing about this. I don't care about any of the perspective line parts that are inside of this rectangle. It's only what's outside. This is the far spot. This is parallel to you. It's flat, just like the front of that rectangle. So, if you want to then make the edges of the wall and the ceiling and the wall and the floor, all you have to do is follow these perspective lines, but follow them from the corner of that back wall. I'm just going to move that up. So you can take, and you can go, and I'm just following it. That was not supposed to be red. Let's turn that black. Okay. So I'm just going to follow this line. And honestly, oh, that wasn't supposed to happen either. Right now, the horizon line doesn't exactly matter. And also for right now, I'm just going to make the perspective lines invisible and the horizon line. So, you are sitting in a chair, or you are standing on the ground looking down this hallway. You have your right wall, you have your left wall, you have your floor, you have your ceiling. Now, if you have a tiled floor, it all still works exactly the same. Your tiles will go from your vanishing point, and they will go out. They just happen to be going out from or along the floor. So we're going to move this along, And here's one thing. This is where your eyeball has to come in handy. You've got to determine, especially along the bottom, an even width for these tiles to come. So we just go and we make what I guess you consider our even rays. I wish I could just make this a little simpler and a little quicker, but the basics take a little while just to learn. But it's worth it. And I'm keeping my lines here the same width, even though when you would be drawing this you would want to, make it thinner down here at the bottom and thicker as it gets closer to you. But I've got these rays, these nice red rays, and I'm going to just trace basically right on top of them, but only from the bottom edge of that back wall, because the floor does not go up onto the wall. It's kind of common sense. So I'm just going to continue making these nice shiny little rays. And I'm not going to go into full detail on the rest of the walls and whatnot. I will do one other thing. But I've got all these rays, and I'm just going to make all those lines vanish. Now, you've got that, so you've got a bunch of rays along the floor that go, but it's not tiles yet. Now here's the thing. The front and back edges of these tiles will be parallel with this bottom edge of the back wall. It's just like with the rectangle. So all you need to do are basically put in a bunch of horizontal lines. And the closer they get to you, the further apart they're going to get. So I'm just going to finish these suckers up. So bear with me if I'm not talking constantly. Now, one thing I will say, and this is something that students have had a problem with for me, is when they get into the details, they forget one basic rule. What they're drawing is not the stuff that is closest to them. Because they've got that back wall in there, where the back wall and these side walls meet, that's what's furthest away from them. So I'm going to do one thing here that should be able to help out with that. So I'm going to create a couple more vanishing points. Oh, that doesn't matter. And so I'm going to do what you could consider a doorway that leads to another hall. A hall that would be perpendicular. That would go off at a 90-degree angle. So remember, this is a tall hallway, so the doorway is not going to reach all the way to the very tip top. So I'm going to run that along like that, and the bottom still comes down to this corner, which falls along this line. So if I'm going to create an actual doorway, I'm not going to have it start at the very corner, because I'm going to leave just a little bit like a column sticking out, a support beam. But I'm going to follow it up here along like this. And I'm going to do that. Now that's all I actually need a vanishing point or a perspective line for. From here, I just take this down, and don't worry if it doesn't line up with your tiles, that doesn't actually matter. And from this side I'm going to go, and what you get is a doorway along this wall. Now, because I said this was a hallway, I need to have a couple things here. I need to have a line that goes straight across, because I said this was a perpendicular hallway, and the same thing here. So you're going to see a little bit of the ceiling and a little bit of the floor of that hallway. And you could do the same thing on this side and whatnot. Now, in most cases, doorways are all the same height. So if I have more doors on this wall, they're probably going to fall on this perspective line. So I could go ahead, let's just pop a new layer there, and a little further down the hall, and this actually happens in my school, there's another doorway. Now, the closer it gets to you, the wider that door is going to be. So where if you look at the bottom of the hallway that I put in there, it's 3 tiles wide according to this drawing. It still would be 3 tiles wide on here, but those tiles are much bigger. So you kind of have to eyeball this, use your best judgment. But you get a line along that perspective line. You get a vertical line to the bottom on either side. And you'll notice this right one goes right off the page. Now from here I can see what would be the ceiling, and I can see just a little bit of what that floor would be. Now in my school this would be the business hallway, or a little alcove to the business room. The door's kind of weird. But you can do this with a lot of different things. If you have another wall right here, say this is just a small little alcove that goes like that. Wow, that's really ugly. Let me redo that. Let's say you've got a small little alcove with a straight wall that goes like that. Then this line is not entirely true anymore. And neither is the bottom line. So actually I can just get rid of these. Let me get rid of those. So now my lines are going to go still horizontal, but they only go to that back wall. And this line here, to show you that it's a back wall, will go from the perspective line like that. And from here, it will do the same. Sorta. I can't even tell if that's right. That's not entirely right. So, there you have the very basics of one-point perspective drawing. You can use this to create more details, but remember, everything that moves away from you goes to that vanishing point. Everything that is facing you is what you could say a flat surface. It will have its vertical lines, it will have its horizontal lines. But all of the lines that move through space go to that vanishing point. It's as simple as that. Next week, we're going to look at two-point perspective, and we're going to look at how this can be used to create something as vast as a city. So until next week, practice, get a little better at this. I will see you again on Tuesday for the Wide World of Geek. Have yourselves a great weekend, and just keep working. See you later.